All right, should be recording now. So today we have Dr. Dustin Crummett joining us. So to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your academic work?
So I got my PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame a couple years ago. I'm now a postdoc at the. You can see my cat is in. I'm doing a postdoc at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. It's part of a European Research Council project on animals and the philosophy of the Islamic world. I don't myself have any background in Islamic philosophy, but I'm here doing work basically in animal ethics.
Yeah.
And I also do work more broadly in philosophy of religion, in ethics and political philosophy.
Yeah. Talking about animals and your cat jumps in and my dogs start barking. So I don't know if my wife is home. This keeps happening right in the middle of my interview. It's fine. Yeah. So I actually have two dogs and a cat. So I have a cat as well. So I have the door shut in here, so I don't think I'm going to be disturbed. But sometimes she tries to open doors. So we'll see if that happens. So what was your so you kind of gave an overview of the philosophy and the stuff that you do in ethics and all that good stuff. What was your because obviously you're a Christian, like what was your religious background and upbringing like?
I guess I was raised in a pretty conservative, fundamental, or evangelical environment. I went to a Mennonite high school that was run by sort of some more politically liberal Mennonites, I guess. And that probably started me on the path to being politically pretty left-wing, which I am now. I guess over time, I mean, I sort of, I came to doubt some of the stuff that I had been taught growing up. But I was still interested in religion and the question of whether any of this stuff was true, and the question of what was true, if any of it was. And ultimately, I think that's sort of how I got into philosophy. After I went to college, I took some philosophy classes. I became interested in philosophy of religion. Now I'm an Episcopalian. So over time, I've developed some other philosophical interests in some other areas. But
yeah, no, if I was a Christian, I'd probably be an Episcopalian as well. So it's interesting how people. So like you were raised in a more conservative context and started to evolve a little bit more left. I kind of was in like pop evangelicalism, and so that kind of the intellectual side of confessional Calvinism kind of drew me in that direction. I mean, which I am not anymore. But anyway, like it's just interesting people's trajectories. And you kind of already, one of the other questions I had was how have your views evolved? And you kind of already answered that question as well. Sort of starting off, and that's interesting, like in a Mennonite background, and now a little bit more liberally. I guess we could talk, maybe if we have some time after talking about the paper, we could talk, because I think the first time I saw you was on Capturing Christianity's channel. I think Michael Brown, I think you were discussing Trump support. That was a good discussion, but I was like, that's interesting. I need to read some more of his stuff. Actually, too, the other thing, I saw the paper. I actually didn't know it was you because I follow Felipe Leon's blog, Atheist Philosopher, and he had linked a paper to the paper we're going to talk about today at a different time, and I saw that first. Then I saw you on Capturing Christianity, and I didn't realize it was the same person that did both. I was like, whoa, this would be interesting to talk about. So that's kind of how this kind of happened, at least in my mind. I guess, so evolving views, you kind of went, like theologically, you kind of walked through that, but is there any like philosophical views that you like, has your mind changed as you've been studying philosophy on certain things, like evolved in any way?
Yeah, well, it's certainly evolved in the sense that I've developed lots of positions that maybe originally were kind of inchoate. They've become more articulated. I have changed my mind. I mean, it depends a little bit on how far back we want to go.
Right.
Of course, when I was 13, I had all sorts of views that I've since changed.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I've gone through a couple different. I mean, I've had different views, for instance, about what the right normative ethical theory is at different points. I went, at times I was sort of a particularist or pluralist. At times I was a sort of consequentialist. Now I'm kind of sympathetic to some form of Scanlon-style contractualism. Though Scanlon wants to exclude animals from the social contract, so I think the view needs to be modified to get Apollo in there. Yeah, so I mean I've changed my mind about that. I've sort of I guess when I started studying philosophy, I was kind of the view that if you were going to be a theist, you might need to be some sort of fideist or make the decision on pragmatic grounds or something like that. I didn't really think that any of the natural theological arguments worked. And that's something that I've changed my mind about as I've studied philosophy. I've come to think that a number of them are actually pretty good. Yeah, I'm sure that I could come up with a lot of other things that I've changed my mind about too. But yeah, I've definitely. I don't know if there's any very firm, pattern to how my views have changed, but I certainly have changed on different issues because I considered new arguments, or sometimes you see a problem with a certain view, and initially you think, well, that's not so bad, and then you think about it more and more, and eventually you think, I guess this view can't really work.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's been interesting about philosophy of religion, because like I've said elsewhere, like my deconversion from Christianity was more like Bible and miracle based, certain kind and so I actually got into philosophy of religion afterward. I went from like Christianity to agnosticism. I wasn't like an atheist or anything, and then I was just like, let me think about all this stuff. And it's been more recently that I've come to sort of a tentative atheism, but even then it's so much more fun dealing with philosophy of religion, because it's not like apologetics where it's like, because like you said, there's someone like you might say this theistic argument is dumb, like here's why. and because there's more freedom to kind of criticize your own side, it seems like, at least to me. Even with an atheist philosophy of religion, it's just, I don't know, that kind of freedom to be open-minded. I like that a lot, just in general. Another thing you mentioned, ethics, and like that's another thing I want to think about, at least on my own, more. Like I've read like Eric Wielenberg and some of that stuff, like about how moral ontology. I mean, it's not all connected, but like I need to work out my views on moral ontology. That's another thing that I need to think about more. But as we go, so before we get into the specifics of your paper, can we set the stage let's set the stage, and can you briefly give an overview of like the variations of the problem of evil? I mean, so obviously there's variations of the evidential version, but there's also like the logical. So could you just kind of lay that out?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, there are a million different versions of the problem of evil.
Right.
The kind of potted history people give is people used to think that it should be put in the form of a deductive argument. There's some sort of logical incompatibility between the claim that God exists and is wholly good and all-powerful and all-knowing on the one hand, and the claim that evil exists on the other. There's no obvious logical incompatibility. I mean, it's not like if you write those two things down, you're going to be able to derive a contradiction or something. So there has to be some other set of principles that you're going to rely on that are self-evident, it shows you what the contradiction is, right? Ultimately, I think it turned out no one could really produce plausible candidates for what the other principles were that would allow you to derive a contradiction. So now, not everyone agrees, but most people agree there's not a logical contradiction in saying that God exists and evil exists. But you might still think evil is really good evidence against theism, right? There are all sorts of things that, there's no logical contradiction between saying that the Earth is flat and that we have all this evidence that but of course it's nonetheless our evidence that the Earth is round is really good evidence that the Earth is not flat, even if it's not. You can't put it in the form of a deductive entailment or something.
Right.
So now people focus on evidential versions. There are different ways of framing it formally, whether you want it to be inductive, whether you want it to be an inference to the best explanation, whether you want it to be a Bayesian argument. And there are also different pieces of data that you might focus on. Some people want to focus on some particular really horrific event. Some people want to focus on the way that evil is distributed in the world. Some people want to focus on the amount of evil in the world. So some people focus more on human suffering. Some people focus more on animal suffering. My paper is arguing that if we attend to insects and other sort of critters, it may be that you get a new version of the problem of evil that is worth paying attention to because it raises sort of special challenges, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Did that all make sense?
No, yeah, definitely. I was actually going to ask a couple more questions about kind of the distinction between logical and evidential versions of the argument. What are your thoughts on? So I know, like I've read, I think J.L. Schellenberg wrote a chapter in a book called a new logical problem of evil. I think it was like the Blackwell companion to some problem of evil or something. I don't know if you read that, or I don't know what your thoughts on that. Those, because I think him and I think so. Felipe Leon has defended Mackey's logical argument from evil, not in the sense that like it shouldn't necessarily. If I'm remembering correctly, he's kind of defending it in a way where it's like if the premises for an atheist seem more plausible than not, then it's kind of rational to go with it, even if it wouldn't necessarily drive a contradiction for someone that's a theist. That could be wrong. I could be remembering incorrectly, but like It's almost like he's defending it in a weaker sense, but still saying this is a valuable argument kind of within the canon. Because I know the book has got the best explanation of things where he dialogued with Josh Rasmussen. I think one of the things he went through was kind of laying out the logical problem and was part of the cumulative case, if you will, for his chapter. I don't know if you had thoughts on the contemporary defenses of logical problems of evil, like that.
Yeah, so I haven't read that. I mean, my initial inclination is to say, if you think that you're giving a deductive argument, but there's a substantial amount of uncertainty in the premises, it may not be importantly different from an evidential argument, right? You might not wind up with higher credence at the end. It might just be kind of a notational variant, or it's a different way of structuring the argument semantically, but it may not be interestingly all that different. But I don't want to say that that's necessarily the case because I haven't seen the particular way that Felipe frames it, and so I don't want to. I mean, it could be that that's not the case.
Yeah, I'm just going from memory too. The Schellenberg paper was interesting though, just because it was a lot different than like Mackey's version in the way that he structured it. But I need to dig more into that. But what would you say, like, as far as like there's different, like you said, there's like tons of ways to frame like the evidential problem of evil, like biological role of pain and pleasure and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Is there a specific variation that you think is like stronger than other ones, just in your personal opinion?
Yeah. Well, so in terms of structure, I mean, I'm generally sympathetic to some sort of Bayesian picture of epistemic rationality. And so I think that Bayesian formulations of the argument, that's kind of like the right way to formulate it. Mm-hmm. In terms of content or what piece of data are you appealing to? The one that I think is hardest is or the family of versions that I think are hardest are ones that involve animal suffering. Mm-hmm. And there are different things about animal suffering that you can take to be particularly problematic. But I think animal suffering is the hardest. I mean, there's a lot more of it, for one thing, than there is human suffering. There are a lot more wild animals in the world than there are people, and they've been around a whole lot longer. probably wild animals have worse lives, if you count the proportion of good to evil in them than human beings do. A lot of the theodicies that people employ don't apply very obviously to wild animals. So yeah, I think that animal suffering is sort of the hardest problem for the theist. I'm actually in the early stages of working on a book manuscript about the problem of wild animal suffering, and I also plan to get a bit into some ethical questions. So there's a kind of burgeoning literature about it. It may be that someday in the foreseeable future we will be able to intervene on a large scale in the natural world to reduce the amount of animal suffering. We already do this a little bit right now, actually. So, for instance, we can distribute vaccines for certain diseases via like bait, like oral vaccines, and combat diseases. And we do that for our own purposes. We don't want animals to serve as reservoirs for rabies that could be transmitted to human beings or whatever. But we may, with CRISPR, with other technologies, be able to more radically, do gene drives. Some people have what sound like very science fictional scenarios. Maybe we could eliminate predation and keep animal populations in check through other methods. And so there are these discussions about whether, suppose the technology panned out and we could really do that. Would that be a good thing for us to do or not? It seems like the case in favor is pretty obvious. Well, there would be a lot less suffering if we made things better. Yeah. There are philosophers who have also, though, feel uneasy about it for one reason or another. They've raised various objections. So that question of should we ultimately prove capable of improving the condition of wild animals, should we do it? That's also something that I'm thinking about lately. But yeah,
that's interesting. I was gonna near the end. I was gonna say, what upcoming projects are you working on? But you kind of already answered that. But that's actually really interesting. So I will definitely be looking for that. But don't worry. William Lane Craig says animals don't suffer. So I don't know what I don't know what you're talking about. They don't feel, I don't know if you've seen those clips where I think it was he said it in multiple places, but I think he really he debated Stephen Law, and I think he was saying what I take to be silly things, but I won't go down that path.
In philosophy, at the end, there are like no rules, right? You can say whatever you want. If you decide that the existence of consciousness is not compatible with your worldview, you can say, well, I guess I'm just not conscious, like nobody's going to stop you. I feel kind of the same way about some of these neo-Cartesian solutions to the problem of animal suffering. Well, they just don't really feel pain. There's a band called the 21st Century Monads, which is there are a couple of philosophy professors who formed a band, and they have a song called "This Is Not the Actual World," and it's sung from the perspective of a narrator who thinks, look, obviously God would actualize the best possible world, but obviously this is not the best possible world. So it turns out that we must just not exist. It turns out that this world is actual. We're just in one of the merely possible worlds. You could say that, right? That would solve the problem. It just, that's kind of how I feel about some of the neo-Cartesian type roots. It doesn't seem like that can be right.
Well, animals are like NPCs in a video game. There, I solved it. They're not real. Birds aren't real. So, what is So now let's get more into the paper. So can you and you've kind of already done it. So the paper, I don't remember if I said the title of the paper before we actually started recording or after, but the paper's called The Problem of Evil and the Suffering of Creeping Things. So can you give like a brief outline or summary of the paper, just kind of airplane view of what you're doing?
Yeah, so it's an attempt to call our attention to what may be kind of a new version of the problem of evil. This is, I mean, you said philosophers of religion, we prize trying to be very fair-minded, maybe criticizing our own side, this sort of stuff. So I'm wondering if there's a new argument for atheism,
Right.
even though I'm not an atheist, right? And the rough outline is something like, look, you have creatures like arthropods, which include insects and mites and all sorts of other little critters. We don't quite know whether these creatures can, whether they're sentient, whether things can go better or worse for them in kind of the morally relevant sense, whether they have kind of morally relevant interests. There's philosophical disagreement about what that requires, for one thing, and then there's empirical disagreement about whether they have conscious experiences and stuff like this. There was a paper that came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a couple years ago that said, yeah, they might. The journal Animal Sentience ran a bunch of papers where people said, no, that doesn't make sense. They don't have the right neural structures, whatever. So I'm not really taking a stance on whether or not insects can suffer in a morally relevant way, and other creatures, and similar creatures. I'm just saying it doesn't seem like it's crazy. I mean, it's something that's a live discussion. And if they can, then that might have really important implications.
Mm-hmm.
Why might that have really important implications for the problem of evil? Well, there are vast numbers of these creatures. Estimates vary widely because how are you really going to make an estimate? It's very difficult, but maybe there are quintillions of them in the world. There's some, orders of magnitude more than us. They've been around way longer. And so if they can feel pain, say, even if their pain is much less bad than ours, even if it's only 1/10,000th as bad, say, then collectively the amount of pain they're feeling is going to be much greater than all the pain that we're feeling, right? So at least by some measure, the amount of evil in the world is going to be drastically increased. Another problem is that the proportion of good to evil in the world is going to be skewed negatively. So there's a general worry, and this is also people who are working on the wild animal welfare question, the question of whether we should intervene to help wild animals if we can. This is also something they talk about. We K-select, which means that we have basically comparatively few offspring, which have a much higher survival rate comparatively. So our reproduction rate is limited by the carrying capacity, I think is what that means. Other animals, I mean, and cats, K-select, large mammals, all sort of K-select. There are other animals like mice, like insects, who are select. So they just have as many offspring. I mean, their evolutionary strategy is that they produce vast numbers of offspring and very few of them survive. And so they're limited just by the rate of reproduction. Animals that are select, if you're an R-selected animal, then your prospects are a lot worse, right? Because if you're an R-selected animal, there's a really good chance that you're going to die really soon, having done nothing, just having, crawled around for a bit, then get eaten or starved to death or something like that. So if R-selected animals are kind of morally relevant subjects of concern, whatever that requires, then that's going to be worrisome, because it means that now there are just these vast numbers of individuals who die without kind of any chance to flourish or really do anything, right? If creatures like arthropods are morally relevant, then that's kind of taken to the extreme, because insects just have vast numbers of offspring and very few survive in many cases, right? And then a third worry is that I said, a lot of times it's harder to apply certain theodicies to the suffering of animals. Um, well, that's true, but there are people who have developed theodicies attempting to explain the suffering of animals. And it turns out a lot of those are going to be, I think, much harder to apply to creatures like insects because they have so little in the way of cognitive sophistication and so on.
Mhm.
So, uh, people think, well, it gives the existence of natural evil gives animals the ability to not to make, morally free choices, but to make kind of morally important to undertake certain kinds of morally important actions to shield their young from a predator or to feed them in harsh conditions, or maybe it provides them with some kind of post-mortem opportunity for soul making or whatever. And however plausible you think that is, it seems at least more plausible if you're talking about cats, say, than if you're talking about an ant or a termite or something like that. Where there's so little in the way of cognitive sophistication, you really kind of wonder, can they possess virtues? Can they learn from their suffering? Even if, they go to heaven and their cognitive faculties are enhanced or whatever, if I'm like, well, you used to be a termite, you might kind of be like, oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's a little hard. It would be a little hard to like identify with your previous termite self, maybe to learn the lessons from when you like starved to death for 6 hours or something. And so some of the theodicies that people have developed are going to be much harder to apply.
Mm-hmm.
So I say, I'm not saying that insects can suffer and similar creatures can suffer, but I mean, it's not absurd to think that they might. And if they did, the implications would be significant because it would, it seems like, drastically increase the amount of evil, drastically skew the proportion of good to evil for the worse, and it would be harder to explain using some of our theodicies.
Yeah,
so that's the rough idea.
Right. Well, the solution to ants, understanding their suffering is just mystery. That's the solution. Anyway, so it was interesting. Well, actually, I don't want to get ahead of myself. One of the questions I was going to ask was, what sorts of creeping things are you focusing on? You sort of answered that already. So we're using the term suffering or suffer. Mm-hmm. I think you defined it. You defined what you meant by it, and I think later in the paper you mentioned like it would depend on like your views on some other things as what you take suffering to mean. But like, what was the definition that you gave for suffer, and why do you think that?
Yeah, so I think I said it's
or some roughly.
Yeah. So I mean, in ordinary speech, suffering has some kind of it means you're in pain or anguish or something like that, and it may be that suffering requires that. But I kind of stipulate I'm using suffering to mean you suffer whenever anything that's bad for you happens. And we can distinguish between, I mean, sometimes you talk about something being bad for your car, say, not changing the oil or whatever, and that just means it degrades its functionality or something like that. There's a different sense when we talk about something being good or bad for you. It's better for your sake. And so the question is whether insects are the sorts of things that I think that my cats say things can go better or worse for them in the way that things can go better or worse for me, right? It makes sense to be concerned on their behalf about what happens to them in a way that it doesn't make sense to be concerned on my car's behalf about what happens to my car. So the question is, are insects the sort of things which are such that it makes sense to be concerned on their behalf about what happens to them? And the answer to that is going to depend on what your theory of well-being is. So broadly speaking, there are three approaches to well-being in the philosophical literature. There's some overlap. There are ways of making hybrid theories and things like that. So this isn't a hard and fast categorization or whatever. But one is hedonism. So what's good and bad for you is nice experiences and nasty experiences, right? So certain sorts of conscious experiences. If you think that, then you'll think that whether things can be good or bad for insects in the relevant way depends on whether they're conscious, whether they're sentient. Another approach is the desire satisfaction theory. And this says whether things are good or bad for you depends on whether your desires are satisfied or frustrated. If that's right, then it might whether things can be good or bad for insects will depend on whether they have desires or not. There are variations which say no, only what only matters is your conscious desires that somehow show up in your awareness, or things that can be kind of idealized based on your conscious desires. And if that's right, then it might be that this collapses into so sentience is the thing that matters again. And then there are objective list theories, which say roughly there are some things that are just kind of objectively good or bad for you. And even if they don't affect your conscious experience, and even if you don't care about them, they can still affect your well-being. So some people think, part of being well off is being virtuous. And maybe you say, I don't care about being virtuous or whatever. Well, no, that doesn't matter. It's just virtue in and of itself is good for you. And vice in and of itself is bad for you. And if you don't care about it, then you're just mistaken about what you have reason to care about, then there are other, ways of modifying the objective list theory. So you might think consciousness is a precondition for things mattering at all. But once you are conscious, there are things that can matter in this objective way too. So there are different views about what it takes for insects to be able to suffer in the sense that I mean. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, they might give different answers. I mean, if you think that, say, desires are the only thing that matters, they don't have to be conscious desires or anything like that, just desires. And if you're a kind of functionalist about desires, if you think desiring something is just a matter of being disposed to behave in a certain way, then you might think, well, insects can have desires even if they're not sentient. And so things could be good or bad for them even if they don't have any conscious experiences. That's not my view. I'm inclined to think that they're only going to have moral standing if they're sentient. And so then for me, the question becomes whether they can have conscious experiences or not. But not everyone agrees with that.
Yeah. I guess, and again, there's a lot to think about there. And I guess my own, prima facie, just common sense view would be like I said, I have a cat, and occasionally I'll wake up and there's a dead roach somewhere in my house. And, mm-hmm. but occasionally the roach is still squirming and mm-hmm. what I, at least initially, take to be probably agony, and maybe not in the way that I would think, of like a cow suffering or something like that, but still enough mm-hmm. to be like, okay, we evolved, that have probably evolved to feel try to feel mm-hmm. certain kinds of things to get away from pain and to not die. And so probably it's experiencing pain because they're writhing. Could be wrong, but it just seems like I guess I'm leaning towards a more common sense view of probably it seems like they're probably suffering in some, well, again, I'm using suffering maybe not exactly as the way that you've laid out, whether it's good or bad, but just more in a common sense way where it just seems like they're in pain. But I don't want to derail it, but that's just, I guess it's an initial.
Yeah. And that's sort of something that I talk about is it doesn't seem intuitively that weird to think that insects have experiences, right? People tend to think that they can feel pain. If you see, a kid pulling the wings off of flies or something like that.
You'd worry
so
they
I don't
become
think
a psychopath or something.
It's definitely intuitively weird to think insect suffering is the worst thing in the world. Right. But I say, well, that kind of follows from other things, There are, people who are skeptical of insect suffering will point out there are cases where human beings, we know, can engage in sort of basic behaviors like this, even though they're not conscious. Mm-hmm. I don't want to try to give specific examples because I'm worried that I'll butcher them. But we know that can happen sometimes with human beings, and so they'll think actually, a lot of this sort of basic aversive behavior and whatever, that's subconscious stuff, and maybe that's all that insects are doing, and so maybe we have to be careful trusting our intuitive judgments based on their behavior or whatever. Again, I'm not trying to really take a stance on that sort of question either way. But
right. I mean, it'll be interesting the more I guess the more we learn about like biology, and the more we start to understand like their nervous systems or whatever. I might be butchering what I'm saying too, but like just understand how it, the more we understand about science, the more we'll probably be able to answer some of these questions about like possibly the degree which they might suffer or feel pain at least. Yeah, I thought it was interesting too because like, well, you provided some quotes where I think there was like a Darwin quote where there was like I think the example was like, I don't know forget what bug it was, but like being eaten from the inside out by something else. And there was even an example, I think you said they put like a swarm of insects on trial or something. What was that example? That seemed interesting to me. That was weird. I never knew.
Yeah, in the Middle Ages, I guess people used to try insects in absentia sometimes for like a locust swarm destroys your crops or something. I think in general they thought it made sense to put animals on trial for things. I mean, at least some of them did because they did it sometimes. If a pig ate a drunkard's face or something like that. But you can't actually bring a locust swarm into the courtroom or whatever, so you have to just try them in absentia. And then I don't know what you can really do once you find them guilty.
Yeah, I thought that was it made me laugh. Like, as I was reading it, it was all really serious, and then there's like this locust swarm that was on trial, and I was like, this is interesting. So, and again, some of these questions are interrelated because you've kind of summarized some of your thoughts. But why do you think that this problem has been neglected? You kind of said that it's been neglected, and I'm assuming it has to do with the fact that people probably don't think that insects feel pain in the same way that we would. But do you want to say anything else about that?
Well, I think, I think most people just haven't thought about it all that much, to be honest. I think, in general, the problem of animal suffering has not received nearly as much attention as problems related to human suffering. Which you might think, well, we're humans, we're interested in our own stuff. Okay. That's a little, I think that's kind of a mistake because, probably like 99.999% of suffering has been, maybe more than that, has been animal suffering, historically. So human suffering is just a very tiny sliver of all the suffering that's happened in the world, and it's happening in the world right now, most likely. So in general, animal suffering has probably not received as much attention as it should have. When it comes to the question of insect suffering specifically and arthropod suffering more generally and whatever, a lot of people think they're just not sentient, they just can't suffer. And probably not because they've really looked into it or whatever. That's just kind of their snap judgment. And a lot of people think, if they can, then it's probably not nearly as bad. So it's not going to be that worrisome. And I sort of agree. It seems plausible to think that if they can, it's probably not going to be nearly as bad. But then you need to think about the fact that there are so many of them too.
Right.
And that's not something that's kind of intuitively an obvious thought. Like, well, wait a minute, how many insects are there in the world, and how not bad do we really think it is? And so there are some people in the kind of ethicsy side of things who have been worried about insect suffering as part of this broader project of wanting to reduce animal suffering. And of course, it could turn out, even if you think there's a really, really low chance that insects can suffer, it could be that in expected utility terms, it matters a lot for our decision making, right? Because if they can, there's going to be so much. So there are people who weren't me who started thinking about that in that context. But I think people, it seems like an intuitively weird idea to people, and people kind of dismiss it maybe because they haven't thought so much about the concrete reason that you would to get to the conclusion that actually this might be really bad.
Yeah. I mean, I think too. I mean, even with higher order animals, people. I mean, kind of some people will say things like, like they don't suffer in the same way we do. It's kind of like a way to, I guess, transfer. Well, not transfer, but like not have as much responsibility for the suffering you may be causing or something like that, because you can just rationalize it as if like, well, this and the this other creature doesn't suffer as much as I do, and it's almost like again, I keep going back to the NPC because I think it's funny. It's kind of like an NPC in a video game or something. Like it obviously might suffer some, but it's not even close or really relevant to us at all.
Yeah,
just that's weird.
There's a part. David Foster Wallace has this essay called "Consider the Lobster," where he goes to this like lobster boiling festival in Maine or someplace where they boil the lobsters alive, and he talks to some guy who's telling him like, oh, don't worry, lobsters can't feel pain, and gives some kind of scientific explanation for this. And then in the narration, he's like, I don't think what this guy said is actually true. Like I'm not sure if he knew what he was talking about, but I guess this guy found it a comforting thought. I don't know whether lobsters feel pain or not.
Yeah,
but
I think it's probably just like a disposition that we have to kind of so we don't worry about our behaviors, to kind of rationalize things in that way. So what I'm saying is that because we do it to other higher order animals, I don't see why it wouldn't probably apply to people doing it to lower order animals too, where it's like instead of granting kind of like an initial or prima facie, like it looks like it's suffering, maybe it is. It's like, well, no, it can't be because whatever reasons you want to say, or feel pain. I keep moving back and forth between those. I don't mean to do that. I'm just trying to be clear. Because that's just how in my head I view it sometimes. But so what you call the premise, or at least part of the paper, was a reasonably large portion of creeping things can suffer. And you didn't take like a hard stance because you were very open-minded and were like, thinking about how it might play out. But like it seems like you at least find it plausible, even though you wouldn't necessarily commit one way or another. Am I understanding correctly?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think it's at least worth thinking about. I'll say that.
Yeah. We sort of already talked about like how views of what suffering is might affect certain things. And again, you kind of sketched this out broadly when we started talking about it before, but you kind of went over the reason it makes the problem of evil worse because like the amount is different, the proportion of good and evil is different in the application of theodicies. But let's kind of go into those one at a time, a little bit more into detail. So, how does the amount make the problem of evil worse? And then also, what are I know there's a couple objections or several objections that you kind of went over to that kind of observation.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are different ways of thinking about exactly what the problematic data is or are, what the problematic data are when it comes to the problem of evil, right? The amount of evil has something to do with it. If there was like way less evil in the world, then it seems like the problem of evil would not be as strong. There's a question about whether the amount of evil just itself matters. So like if there were twice as many people in the world, I guess there would be twice as much evil. Would that make the problem of evil more serious? Or like if we learned that there were aliens who were living like us, would that make the problem of evil worse just because there would be more evil? I kind of think not. But nonetheless, there is some connection between the amount of evil and how bad the problem of evil is, right? Of some sort. Maybe it's not just that the amount of evil matters in itself, but maybe it matters, because it's connected to the relative amounts of good and evil in the world or something like that. That's the thought about why it matters. One objection that I encounter is people think, and this may be another reason that people don't take the problem seriously usually, or haven't in the past, is people think that the suffering may not aggregate in the right way. So I sort of assumed that enough teeny tiny instances of suffering would add up to as much as like one really big instance of suffering, right? And some people think that's not right. They think, there's no amount of headaches that could be as bad as being tortured for a year or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no number of hangnails that could be as bad as being tortured for a year. Even a trillion hangnails wouldn't be. And it's not because, you could never get enough. It's because just there's some sort of incommensurability between really serious evils and really trivial evils. And if you think that, then you might think, well, no matter how many insects there are, if it's the case that they're not really suffering very much, then this vast number of sort of trivial evils is not going to be as bad as even one really, really serious evil that might be faced by a human being or by some other higher animal or whatever. Hey, bud.
Your cat disagrees.
Yeah, are you an anti-aggregationist? My view is that this position ultimately just doesn't work. So on the one hand, I mean, we have reasons, I think, to be skeptical. I mean, the reason for holding this view is just sort of a brute intuition, right? You just think about some really bad thing, and then you think about some huge number of trivial things, and the really bad thing seems worse. But there are pretty well-known cognitive biases that it seems like would produce that intuition, whether or not it was veridical. So, for instance, we know, and there are a number of these, but one of them is, for instance, we know that people are subject to scope and sensitivity. Mm-hmm. So, if you ask people, how much money would you pay to save 1,000 seagulls from an oil spill? They'll be like $25. And if you ask people, how much money would you pay to save 1,000,000 seagulls from an oil spill? They'll say $27. It doesn't. It doesn't. They're not actually responding to the specific number. It's just once you get up to like too many seagulls to like keep track of, just a bunch of seagulls, the number no longer matters anymore, right? For in terms of the intuitive force,
right?
And so it seems like, do my intuitions distinguish between the badness of 1,000 headaches and 58 quadrillion headaches? Like, no, it's just both a bunch of headaches, right? And so it seems quite suspicious whether we can really trust our intuitions about how bad a huge number of small evils is. There's this joke about an astronomer is giving a talk, and he says that the sun is going to burn out in 5 billion years. And this guy runs out of the room crying, and somebody comes to get him, and they're like, what's wrong? And the guy's like, the world is going to end, the sun's going to burn out. And the guy says, it's not going to happen for 5 billion years. And the guy says, oh, thank God, I thought he said 5 million years. And, in fact, 5 million years is a lot closer, right? Mm-hmm. But the reason the joke works is like, well, I mean, you can't really, your emotional reaction is not going to respond to that, right? So I don't think that we have good reasons to trust this intuition on the one hand. I think we have convincing error theories. And on the other hand, it looks like we have good arguments against the intuition. And basically, this will be a little complicated, so I hope I can explain it in a way that makes. I should have thought beforehand about what the best way to verbally explain this is. But so if you imagine, the year of intense suffering, and then you imagine two people. One person suffers a year of intense suffering. Then you imagine two people are both going to suffer 364 days and 23 hours of intense suffering. It seems like here we want to grant, okay, the two people suffering the very slightly worse evil, that's worse than the one person suffering a year. Then we imagine 4 people suffering 364 days and 22 hours, and we think that's worse. And we can construct this chain, right, where you wind up with, at the bottom of the chain, some tremendous number of people are going to suffer for a minute. And it looks like we agreed, as we went by piece, we agreed each step in the chain was worse than the previous one. So it looks like we either have to say, therefore, the last step in the chain is worse than the first one. So enough people suffering for a minute is worse than one person suffering for a year. Or we have to say that transitivity is violated. So transitivity says that if X is worse than Y and Y is worse than Z, then X is worse than Z, right? We'll have to say that even though each step in the chain was worse than the previous one, the final step was not worse than the first step. And that seems very counterintuitive, and there are also some good arguments for that. It looks like if you have intransitive preferences, for instance, then people can run a money pump on you. They can create a situation where by acting in accordance with your preferences, you'll make decisions that you can make a series of decisions which wind up leaving you worse off, and you get nothing in exchange. And so I think that this kind of anti-aggregation move, the reason for it, the intuition behind it, can be error theorized, and it winds up having other kind of serious problems in our value theory because it looks like there are good arguments against it.
Yeah, no, my intuitive response to what you just said with like that chain is like, it seems like to get off the bus at a certain point would be totally arbitrary. Like that's like it just seems totally arbitrary to like pick a certain point. If you're gonna allow the analogy to work, you can't just have your cake and eat it too at the beginning, and then at the bottom to be like, well, I want to get off here randomly. Like why? And I've heard that before, and it's interesting because like even regardless of like the I keep saying insect, but we're talking about specific kinds, anyway. But just in general with the problems of evil and regarding animal suffering, like it is often said like sort of like combining them into like a lump of it's like well, we're really interested in individual suffering and how those individual sufferings could be redeemed, like in an afterlife or whatever, rather than lumping it. Like the problem of evil shouldn't be construed as lumping it all into this one big quantity or whatever. So I don't really buy that. I think what you just said makes sense to me, at least initially.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. The reason you care about the suffering, I think, is because it's affecting these individuals that you care about, right? So in that sense, ultimately, what I think matters is not the world, it is the individuals. But then you have a question about how to aggregate the concerns of different individuals, and it may be that what these transitivity type arguments show us is that even though what we're concerned about is the individuals and not the world, well, at least in a certain respect, you should be more concerned about a whole bunch of individuals suffering a little bit than one individual suffering more. There might be other reasons why you should care more about the one single individual, and that's, I think, compatible with what I say. But
so again, you've touched on a lot of this stuff already, but the proportion of evil to good, is there anything else you want to say about that problem?
I don't think so. I mean, the thought will just be that because insects, so many of them fail to flourish. In general, there's going to be an issue where sort of the further down the chain of sophistication you go, the further down moral standing extends, the worse the proportion is going to be, because I think the proportion is going to get worse and worse as you go down because of facts about the reproductive strategy and shorter life cycles and this sort of stuff. And so, I think it's self-explanatory once people kind of get the biological basis of it.
Right. And the third thing was the application of theodicies. I think that was an interesting one too, because I know one of the more common, well, it seems, I could be wrong about this, but it seems like an animal afterlife in general is becoming more I guess, more popular with some Christians, at least in philosophy. Because I think, obviously, like Trent, I think Doherty, am I saying that right? Trent Doherty. I haven't read his book, but I've listened to him talk about it. I think it was Dale Tuggy interviewed him. Anyway, I've listened to him summarize like his views, and I think Rasmussen defended what he calls like the great story of theodicy in his dialogue with Philippe Leon, and I think that he might have mentioned animals. I don't remember again, but it was funny because this is a little bit separate, but like I was reading that and I was like, and this seems like his great story theodicy seems like it's hinting at like ultimate redemption as like a picture, and then I come to find that he's written a book on universalism, and I'm like, aha, I could tell. Anyway, would you say that the animal afterlife stuff is, well, okay, I'm gonna back up. Just talk in general about the application of theodicies and specifically that one, how that might not work as well as maybe intended if it's true that insects experience pain and or suffering.
Yeah, so I've actually written, I have a paper, I have a paper in this book in which I argue that if you're a theist, you should believe for reasons independent of theodicy in an animal afterlife. There are good ethical arguments for thinking that God would give animals a good afterlife, apart from anything having to do with the problem of evil specifically. I think that that's something theists should believe in anyway. So it's not like it's an ad hoc extra posit. And you might think, well, at least some form of compensation is relevant to the problem of evil. If God just lets all these animals suffer and die, and that's it. Well, that might seem kind of unfair to them or something, right? So, well, at least if they can get compensated in the afterlife, that might help. But you still, even if they get compensated, there's still the question of, well, why did God let this happen in the first place, right? What was the reason for that? Some people have wanted to invoke the afterlife, not just as a form of compensation, but because they think, and this includes not only Doherty, but Faith Paul and Michael Murray floats this idea. He doesn't endorse it, but it's one of a couple ideas he thinks might work. Somehow in the afterlife, the animals themselves have an opportunity to grow as a result of their suffering, to benefit from it in some way. And that might be part of the reason why God allows it to begin with. I think, I'm not saying that this would immediately entail that it doesn't work, but I think it's a little harder to see, what the story is if it's, how the termite is gonna benefit from their suffering in the afterlife or whatever. It may. I'm not saying it means that it doesn't work, but it I think throws some additional challenges in for people who want to invoke the afterlife as part of this, as part of a theodicy, as part of explaining why God allowed the evil to begin with.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I think it's interesting. Like, one of the things I've been thinking about, like, as I've thought about the problem of evil more, and again, like, this is more new to me. I was more of an agnostic before I started thinking about a lot of these topics. But like, I think if someone's not going to, like, if a theist or a Christian, any kind of theist, I guess, isn't going to interpret this data through the lens of like a totally indifferent universe, then I think like the way more empathetic theodicy would be some kind of animal afterlife. So it's kind of like, I don't really care. Like, let me push the ball forward a little bit and just be like, hey, Christians, like, or theists, like, at least that's why I want to talk to people like you. It's like, come on, like, you don't have to believe stupid things about animals. Like, you can still be a theist, and like, if you don't interpret this data through the lens of an indifferent universe, at least kind of think about these things in a more logical and like compassionate way. Because it seems to me, and I've thought, like, if I accepted theism, like, I would, at this point, I'd have to believe something like that, or else it wouldn't be compatible in my brain. At least theism as traditionally defined, with omni properties and all that kind of stuff. So how do you? Well, I've given you so much time to, not poke holes in, but like provide evidence against theism. But what are your favorite arguments for? Well, what are your favorite arguments for theism? I know you said initially, like, when you started this kind of journey, you thought maybe like fideism was kind of like that's how you be a theist. But like, what kind of arguments are you drawn to now?
So I have one paper that's under review right now. That's kind of a new version of the argument from consciousness. I maybe shouldn't go into too many details since it's under review right now.
Sure.
But I think that different versions of the argument from consciousness are quite good. I think some other versions of the design arguments from fine tuning or from the existence of mathematically elegant blah 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 natural laws. I think that some versions of the cosmological argument, maybe the sort of contingency argument that Josh Rasmussen gives, that sort of thing, or that Alex Proust gives. I think some of those are good. I have a paper with Philip Swenson where I defend a version of the moral knowledge argument. So there's the kind of standard moral argument that William Lane Craig gives, that says, look, if God doesn't exist, then moral values and duties don't exist. And I actually don't think that works.
Right.
But there's a different argument that's been given by people like Mark Linville and me and Philip Swenson that says that roughly theism may be the best response to what are called evolutionary debunking arguments against moral knowledge. There's this question if you're a moral realist, but you also realize that our moral faculties are contingent upon this sort of historical evolutionary process that presumably was not aimed at producing knowledge of objective moral reality. How you should reconcile these things. So I think some versions of the moral knowledge argument might be good. I think that there is a kind of historical case to be made for the resurrection. I don't think that it's as strong as people like the McGrews think and say.
Yeah.
But I think there's something to it. And there may be some other arguments that are good too. Those are some of the main ones, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I was going to say everything you said I wanted to jump in on, but like, yeah. Eric Wielenberg is triggered by your mentioning of the debunking arguments. Just kidding. No, I read two of his books. One was more, it was like good, like values and virtues in a godless universe, and the other more complicated one. I said this before, but it was funny. Like when I first started getting into philosophy of religion, my wife is not into this stuff at all. But I was reading his more complicated book on ethics or on moral ontology, and I took a random sentence and I was like, "Come here, let me read this to you." And I was like, such supervenes on blah 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 property or whatever, and she was like, "What are you talking about?" Like this is funny. Also, the problem of evil presupposes God, so all of your effort to try to give evidence for atheism is wrong. But so, quick comments. But I think I also watched or listened to your discussion with Ben Watkins. I don't know if that has to do with some of the stuff you're talking about with consciousness. I think you gave the example of like if you took one part of my brain out and put it in someone else. I don't know if that is at least relevant to your stuff. Yeah,
this is an argument Swinburne gives for substance dualism.
Right.
I think there are also separate arguments for merely property dualism, and I think that actually, I think property dualism is enough to run the argument. The version this co-authored version that I have under review right now, you actually may not even need property dualism. We think it works on panpsychism and some other views too.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
It may actually work on everything except very specific versions of physicalism. So we think. So it may be that you can run a good version without needing first to establish very controversial theses in philosophy of mind, if my co-author and I are right. But yeah, I also think that I am a dualist, and I think that there are good arguments from that too.
With just one last thing, I guess, with like the resurrection stuff, I definitely see why, like, if you combine religious experience, taking that seriously with some of the testimony in the Gospels or whatever, I think I can understand why people would believe it based on that. But like, I know, just it seems at least intuitively for me, like depending on how you view, I'm not really convinced that Hume was making a circular argument. I know that there's disagreement in philosophy about that. There's some people that think he was, and some people that think he wasn't. But regardless of whether he was making a circular argument or not, I think he was onto something in general about miracle claims, and so that shapes at least some of the way that I view that. But like I said, I do understand, like, depending on how much credence you give to sort of religious experience, and then combining it with the testimony that you have, I think that I understand why people, even if I'm not necessarily convinced for those reasons. Anyway.
Yeah. So I think, I don't think Hume's argument is circular. So I mean, one question is the evidence sufficient to establish that it happened? And another question is the evidence at least, decent? And those it could be that one way to read at least half of Hume's argument is to say, even if the evidence is pretty good, the bar is so high for this kind of wild claim you're making, that it's not sufficient to overcome the low prior probability, right? I think whether it's sufficient to overcome the low prior probability is going to depend on how low the prior probability is. That's going to depend in part on whether you have other reasons to accept theism and to think that resurrecting Jesus is the sort of thing that God might do, right?
Right.
I mean, the prior probability cannot be any lower mathematically than the prior probability that God exists and decides to resurrect Jesus. That's like a lower bound on it. So if you have independent reasons to think that might be true, then the prior probability will not be as low as it might otherwise be.
Right.
But that's a whole kind of separate thing.
Yeah, no, definitely. I don't want to get too derailed by that. I think that's definitely interesting. I want to get more into that. There's a lot of stuff I need to read more about. But anyway, I think this is probably a good stopping point. But I appreciate you being generous with your time. We can talk for like a second after this, after I end the broadcast. But thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on.